So imagine you've got this brand new, highly anticipated papal document, right? One that's meant to save humanity from the devastating optimizing logic of artificial intelligence.
Right. It's built to be a shield against the whole technocratic paradigm.
Exactly. Now imagine taking that exact same document with all its modern, soaring rhetoric and running it through the uncompromising, hyper-strict, surgically precise theological machinery of the 1950s.
Oh, it is a genuinely staggering intellectual exercise. I mean, the collision there is frankly explosive.
It really is. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a rigorous diagnostic review of the May 2026 encyclical Magnifica Humanitas.
And we really need to stress, we aren't just looking at a standard commentary or like a pastoral reflection here. We are examining a systematic review written strictly from a pre-Vatican II, pre-1958 Thomistic perspective.
Yeah, which is fascinating. For those of you listening who are, say, writing dissertations on 20th century social doctrine, or those of you in advanced seminary studies, you know exactly what that manualist tradition implies.
Right. The reviewer is basically taking the classical manualist tradition and applying it directly to the language of 2026.
We're talking about an era of theology that prized absolute, unforgiving metaphysical precision above all else. It's the theology of Thomas Aquinas, synthesized and, honestly, weaponized by the magisterium from Pius IX all the way through Pius XII.
Exactly. And the target today is Pope Leo XIV's new encyclical released on May 15th, 2026.
Timed deliberately to coincide with the 135th anniversary of Leo XIII's landmark text, Rerum Novarum, right?
That's right. And, the stated goal of the encyclical is noble. It's urgent. Pope Leo XIV is attempting to safeguard the human person against algorithms, digital spaces, transhumanism.
Basically a culture that reduces people to mere data points.
Yes, exactly. And he uses vocabulary that is very familiar to the modern ear. Things like pluralism, existential dignity, shared truth, relationality.
But, and here is the kicker, the reviewer isn't interested in the pastoral intentions at all. The reviewer is interested purely in the metaphysical architecture.
Right, because if we are going to mount a defense of human nature in the age of artificial intelligence, the reviewer argues we have to know exactly, ontologically, what a human being actually is.
Yeah. And to evaluate that, the reviewer utilizes a tool that has largely fallen out of favor in contemporary theological discourse.
Formal theological censures.
Yes, formal theological censures.
For anyone steeped in historical methodology, the reemergence of these censures in a contemporary review is just, wow, it's fascinating.
It's wild to see them used on a 2026 text. Before the Second Vatican Council, the Church didn't just say an idea was, unhelpful or problematic. Right?
Not at all. The Holy Office had this highly granular grading system, the theological notes and censures, to identify exactly how a proposition deviated from Catholic truth.
And if we look under the hood of that methodology, it's a brilliant diagnostic framework, really. It prevents vague arguments. You can't just call something a heresy if it isn't.
Right, you have very specific grades. The reviewer applies terms like ambigua, meaning the phrasing is dangerously ambiguous, like it could be interpreted in an orthodox or heterodox way.
Or temeraria, right?
Yes, temeraria, meaning rash. Basically a departure from the universal consensus of theologians without sufficient cause.
And then there's male sonans, which means ill-sounding or offensive to pious ears. And, of course, the really heavy artillery.
Oh, yeah, like Favin's Haeresi, favoring heresy, or Favin's Modernismo, favoring modernism.
So by applying this rigid historical grading system to a 2026 document, the reviewer just cuts straight through all the emotive pastoral language to expose the underlying philosophical claims.
Exactly. And the mission of this review, and our mission in this deep dive today, is to map out the exact friction points where modern social doctrine fundamentally clashes with the classical boundaries of the faith.
Let's start right where the rubber meets the road, the concept of dignity.
Ah, yes. Paragraph 53 of Magnifica Humanitas.
Right. In paragraph 53, the encyclical adopts a formulation that actually gained prominence a couple of years earlier in the Francis era. It states, point blank, let me quote this, "Every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being."
And the encyclical justifies this by arguing that God's love is infinite, right? And because God's love for us is unconditional and unending, the dignity of the human person is therefore infinite.
Now, on a purely pastoral, emotional level, that logic feels incredibly validating.
Oh, absolutely. If you are trying to defend a marginalized person against a technocratic state that views them as, I don't know, calling their dignity infinite, sounds like the ultimate trump card.
It does. But the manualist reviewer throws a massive immediate flag on the play here.
Because in classical metaphysics, words have absolute weight. You cannot just borrow a divine attribute to make a pastoral point.
Precisely. The reviewer applies a strict, unyielding Thomistic axiom. Infinitum propried soli Deo competit.
Infinity, in the strict and proper sense, belongs to God alone.
Right. To be a creature is, by very definition, to be bounded. It is to be finite. Let me trace the genealogy of this idea, because the reviewer points directly to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae.
Specifically the first part, question 8, article 1.
Yeah, question 8, article 1. If we pull that thread, Aquinas is asking whether God is in all things. And he affirms that, yes, God is in all things by his essence, presence, and power.
But, and this is key, Aquinas is incredibly careful to avoid pantheism here. Just because God sustains a creature doesn't mean the creature takes on God's nature.
The Latin the reviewer cites from Aquinas here is the absolute linchpin of the argument. Effectus enim divini bonitatis non est ipsa essentia divina. The effect of the divine goodness is not the divine essence itself.
That is so crucial.
If I can offer a visual analogy here, just to make sure we are translating the mechanics of this critique accurately for you all listening. Imagine God's infinite love is a vast, boundless ocean of water.
Okay, I like this.
And the human person is a cup. If you plunge that cup into the ocean, the cup is entirely full. It is sustained by the water, it is overflowing, it is perfected in its capacity.
Right.
But the cup itself does not become an infinite ocean. The cup still has an edge. It has boundaries.
It has to. Otherwise, it's not a cup.
Exactly. The reviewer is essentially saying that by calling the human person infinite, the encyclical accidentally breaks the cup. It blurs the exact creator-creature distinction that is actually necessary to defend humanity.
That is exactly the category error the reviewer identifies. You are taking the infinite ground or source of human dignity, which is indeed God's uncreated love, and mistakenly attributing that infinity to the created effect, which is the human person.
Yeah.
And what makes this critique so compelling is the historical documentation the reviewer brings to bear. They look at the exact phraseology used by previous popes when defending human dignity against some of the greatest horrors in human history.
Right, because it's not like the church didn't have to defend human dignity in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, you had Leo XIII facing down the Industrial Revolution and the commodification of labor.
You had Pius XI writing Mit brennender Sword against the Nazis.
You had Pius XII defending human nature against the totalitarianisms of World War II. Yeah. And yet, and this is the crazy part, none of them ever used the word infinite.
Never.
Oh.
Not once. The manualist tradition possessed a kind of metaphysical discipline that prevented it. Leo III, in Rerum Novarum, simply says dignitatem humanae personae, the dignity of the human person.
Yeah, no modifiers.
Right. And Pius XII, even in his most soaring defenses of humanity, peaks at altissimum dignitatem, the most lofty dignity.
The most lofty.
Exactly. The standard seminary manuals of the early 20th century preferred terms like eminens sublimis or summa inter creaturis, supreme among creatures.
And those terms do everything the modern encyclical wants to do, right? They elevate the human being above all material creation. They establish humanity as the crown of the cosmos.
But they maintain that metaphysical reserve. They keep the boundaries of the cup intact.
Which brings us to the formal censure. The reviewer doesn't just call paragraph 53 an oversight.
No, given how fiercely the manualist tradition protects the creator-creature divide, the reviewer goes hard here.
Does the reviewer drop the temeraria label? I imagine this warrants a formal strike for reckless language.
Yes, absolutely. The formulation is graded temeraria, meaning rash. It's a reckless departure from the established theological tradition. And furthermore, it receives the censure of male sonans. Ill-sounding.
Ill-sounding because of the pantheistic implications.
Precisely. The reviewer argues that while the encyclical's subjective intent is pastoral protection, the objective philosophical language logically tends toward pantheism by assigning an incommunicable divine attribute to a created substance.
Now, you listening might be thinking to yourself, why does this matter? Is this just academics hair-splitting over an adjective?
It's not.
No, the reviewer insists it matters deeply, because if you define dignity as infinite, and you untether it from finite, creaturely limits, you fundamentally alter how dignity interacts with human behavior.
An infinite thing cannot be diminished. An infinite thing cannot be altered.
Exactly. And this brings us to the logical downstream consequence of the first critique. The collision between ontological dignity, moral choices, and the historical justification for retributive justice.
Right, if dignity is this infinite, untouchable block of granite, then how does human sin affect it?
Magnifica Humanitas, in paragraphs 50 and 52, argues quite forcefully that human dignity does not depend on the right or wrong choices made.
The document actually breaks dignity down into a taxonomy of 4 types, which is interesting. It lists moral, social, existential, and ontological.
Let's map those out because the encyclical is doing something very specific here. It acknowledges that there is moral dignity, which relates to how a person directs their free will toward the good.
It also acknowledges social and existential dignity, which relates to living conditions and psychological well-being.
But it anchors the entire weight of human worth in that 4th category, ontological dignity. The encyclical concludes that no sin, failure, humiliation, or exclusion can diminish the profound value of a human life that God has willed and called into being.
To the modern ear, post-Vatican II, this sounds like a basic necessary axiom of Catholic social teaching.
Oh, totally. It sounds like the ultimate safeguard against a cancel culture or a technocratic society that wants to treat underperforming citizens as disposable.
But the pre-1958 manualist hits the brakes with incredible force here, because this formulation totally obscures the vital classical distinction between the Imago Dei and the Similitudo Dei.
The image of God versus the likeness of God. For the advanced theologians listening, this is the absolute crux of classical Christian anthropology. It traces all the way back to the Church Fathers and was really solidified in medieval scholasticism.
Let's look at the mechanics of this, because it's brilliant. The Imago Dei, the image, is baked into our nature as rational creatures. It is the intellect and the will. We cannot lose it.
Exactly. Even the souls in hell retain the Imago Dei.
Right. It is wounded by original sin, it is darkened, but it is never destroyed because it constitutes our very ontological nature. You never stop being a rational creature willed by God.
But the Similitudo Dei, your likeness to God, is entirely different.
Completely different. The likeness is moral. It's our participation in divine goodness through sanctifying grace and virtue.
And crucially, the Similitudo Dei can be lost.
Yes, you can forfeit it entirely through mortal sin.
The classical tradition holds that while your ontological baseline remains, your moral dignity can fall to the level of a beast if you yield to irrational, gravely sinful appetites.
Right. By stating so categorically that dignity is completely impervious to the moral act, the encyclical creates a massive structural problem for how the Church has historically understood justice.
And this is where the theological rubber hits the incredibly controversial road of real-world politics. Capital punishment.
Yes. The reviewer argues that by making human dignity an impenetrable shield untouched by grave sin, the encyclical removes the foundational classical premise for the state's ius gladii, the right of the sword.
Historically, the Church did not view the state's right to execute criminals as a violation of human dignity, right?
Quite the opposite. The Church grounded the ius gladii precisely because man is made in the image of God.
That is deeply counterintuitive to a modern listener.
Very.
We often hear today that we must abolish the death penalty because humans are made in God's image. But the classical tradition argued we execute because they are made in God's image. How does that mechanism work?
The reviewer relies heavily on the scriptural exegesis of the medieval period. They cite Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image.
Wow.
Yeah, and they paired this with Romans 13:4, where St. Paul asserts that the secular authority does not bear the sword in vain, acting as the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer.
So the classical logic operates on the principle of retributive justice. Let's expand on the philosophy of retributive justice, because modern society has largely replaced it with medicinal or rehabilitative justice.
Right. In the modern view, a prison sentence is meant to fix the offender, or at least protects society from them.
But the Thomistic view sees retributive justice as a balancing of the cosmic scales.
Correct. When a person commits a grave crime, say murder, they take a good that does not belong to them. They elevate their own will above the moral order willed by God.
And retributive justice requires that a corresponding good be deprived of the offender to balance those scales and restore the moral equilibrium of the universe.
Yes. The murderer has fundamentally violated the Imago Dei in his victim. By that grave moral failure, he has lost his Similitudo Dei, his moral dignity, and has voluntarily degraded himself.
Aquinas actually says that when a man sins gravely, he falls from human dignity and into the slavish state of the beasts.
He does. Therefore, while his ontological dignity remains, meaning he is still a human soul who must be offered the chance for spiritual repentance, and, a priest should attend him on the scaffold.
His moral dignity has fallen to the point where the civil authority can exact lethal justice. Taking his physical life restores the moral order of justice.
But if, as Magnifica Humanitas claims, dignity is infinite and cannot be diminished by any right or wrong choices made,
that entire historical framework of retributive justice collapses instantly.
Instantly.
So it's not just a subtle shift in emphasis. Is the reviewer saying the encyclical is secretly trying to abolish the death penalty, or is this just sloppy philosophical language?
Oh, the reviewer sees it as a direct rupture. The review notes that in paragraph 55, the encyclical actually groups capital punishment right alongside abortion and euthanasia as actions that are gravely wrong and direct violations of human dignity.
Okay, so it's not a secret at all.
Not at all. The reviewer views this as the ultimate culmination of the Francis-era catechism revision, which declared the death penalty inadmissible.
But to put abortion, the killing of the ultimate innocent, in the exact same moral category as the execution of a convicted murderer, fundamentally rewires the classical understanding of innocence, guilt, and the state's authority.
It does.
How severe is the censure here? Does the reviewer go as far as heresy?
The reviewer is meticulous about this. For the broad formulation that dignity is untouched by sin, the grade is ambigua.
Because one could strain to read it merely as a defense of the indestructible imago Dei.
Right. However, regarding the direct implication that capital punishment is intrinsically opposed to the gospel and an inherent violation of dignity, the reviewer drops the hammer. They assign the censure of Favin's heresy favoring heresy.
That is a staggering diagnostic reading, favoring heresy against the established tradition of retributive justice.
It's heavy.
But it illustrates the interconnectedness of classical theology perfectly. If you change the definition of the human person at the metaphysical root, it ripples outward.
It changes the definition of sin, it changes the definition of justice.
And as we follow the reviewer's logic, it fundamentally alters the church's view on the rights of citizens in a modern political state.
Which leads the reviewer to unleash some of the most historically dense arguments in the entire critique. We're moving from the dignity of the individual to the political philosophy of the state.
Yes. Specifically, the explosive issues of religious liberty, the nature of private property, and what the reviewer sees as the quiet reversal of the magisterium of Pope Leo XIII.
Let's start with religious liberty, because this is a perennial theological battlefield. Paragraph 34 of Magnifica Humanitas leans heavily on the Second Vatican Council's declaration Dignitatis Humanae.
Right, and the encyclical affirms religious freedom as a fundamental right grounded in human dignity that must be guaranteed by law in order to build pluralistic and peaceful societies.
Now, to anyone living in a modern Western democracy, the idea of religious freedom guaranteed by law sounds like basic, unassailable civic common sense.
It is the air we breathe.
It is. But to the ears of a 19th-century pope, it sounds like a condemned error that destroys the social kingship of Christ.
The reviewer contrasts the 2026 encyclical directly with the heavy hitters of the 19th-century magisterium, Pius IX and Leo XIII.
These were popes writing in the aftermath of the French Revolution, watching the rise of secular, liberal nation-states that sought to relegate religion to a purely private hobby.
The reviewer explicitly cites Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors from 1864 and his encyclical Contra Cura. They also heavily feature Leo XIII's encyclical Libertas.
And these historical documents forcefully and explicitly condemn the proposition that liberty of conscience and worship is a proper natural right that should be asserted by civil law.
We really need to explain why they condemned it, because without the mechanics, it just sounds like 19th century tyranny to a modern ear.
It really does.
The classical tradition operated on the principle that error has no rights, only truth has rights. A human being has a natural, God-given right to seek the truth, which for the Catholic means the Catholic faith.
Right.
But a person cannot possess a natural, God-given right to spread falsehood or worship idols. God cannot grant a right to do something objectively evil.
Exactly. So how did the classical tradition handle the reality of a divided, pluralistic society? If you don't have a fundamental right to religious freedom, what framework do you operate under?
You operate under the framework of tolerance.
Yes, and the reviewer points directly to Aquinas for the mechanics of this tolerance. In the Summa, the second part of the second part, question 10, article 11.
Always Aquinas.
Always. He asks whether the rights of unbelievers ought to be tolerated by the state. His answer is highly nuanced. He says, yes, they might be tolerated, but specifically, propter vitandum scandalum, to avoid scandal or to avoid a greater evil.
So if the Catholic state trying to suppress a false religion would cause a civil war or massive bloodshed or the fracturing of society, the state can legitimately tolerate the false religion.
It permits an evil to avoid a worse outcome.
But the reviewer stresses the massive metaphysical chasm between tolerating an error out of political prudence and declaring that spreading a false religion is a natural right grounded in human dignity that must be enshrined in law.
The difference is profound.
It's the difference between saying, I will allow you to play your music loudly at 2 a.m. because if I try to stop you, it will start a violent riot in the neighborhood, versus saying you have a God-given fundamental ontological right to blast your music at 2 a.m. and the law must protect your right to do so.
That is a great way to put it. And the 2026 encyclical's specific praise for building a pluralistic society is the exact socio-political formula that Leo III rejected.
The reviewer notes that modern theologians often deploy a hermeneutic continuity here, right? They try to square the circle.
Oh, all the time. They argue that Vatican II and modern encyclicals are only talking about immunity from state coercion, saying the state shouldn't force conversions, not validating the false truth claims of other religions.
Right, the idea that we aren't saying the false religion is true, we are just saying the state is incompetent to judge religious truth.
But the pre-1958 reviewer totally dismantles that defense. They argue that Quanta Cura specifically condemned the idea that liberty of worship should be proclaimed as a positive legal right.
So by adopting the language of a fundamental right to religious liberty, the reviewer argues that Magnifica Humanitas severs its claimed continuity with Leo XIII.
Which is incredibly ironic, given that the encyclical was published specifically to celebrate the anniversary of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum.
It's wild. And it isn't just religious liberty where the reviewer sees the legacy of Leo XIII being dismantled. The reviewer also identifies a fundamental shift on the bedrock economic issue of private property.
Yes. Shifting to paragraph 66 of the encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas states that private property is always subordinate to the universal destination of goods.
It quotes modern social teaching to assert that the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that claim, because on its face, it seems historically accurate.
Yeah, the church has never said property is an absolute right that trumps human life. The classic medieval example is the starving man. If a man is truly starving to death, he can take an apple from his neighbor's orchard to survive, and it is not considered the sin of theft, because in extreme necessity, all things become common.
That is entirely true. Aquinas explicitly teaches that. Property is not absolute against divine law or extreme human need.
But the Thomistic friction point the reviewer highlights is about the balance and the source of the right to property.
Exactly. When Leo III wrote Rerum Novarum in 1891, he was fighting off the existential threat of rising socialism. To combat the socialist claim that the state should control all means of production, Leo XIII defended private property fiercely as a natural right.
A right grounded in the natural law, derived from man's labor, his rational foresight, and his duty to provide for his family.
It is prior to the state.
Right. The state doesn't give you the right to own property. The state is obliged to protect the right you already have by nature.
But how does the new encyclical tilt the balance? By insisting that property is always subordinate to the universal destination of goods.
The reviewer argues the encyclical functionally demotes private property from a primary natural right to a mere secondary social convention.
The reviewer brings in Pius XI's 1931 encyclical, Quadragesimo Anno, which brilliantly articulated the twofold character of property. Property is both individual and social. The two aspects must be held in balance.
But if you say it is always subordinate, you crush the individual character under the weight of the social character.
Yes.
You are essentially providing theological cover for massive state expropriation of wealth under the guise of the universal destination of goods.
The reviewer argues that Magnifica Humanitas uses the vocabulary of the past, quoting Leo III, referencing the fathers, but rewires the operational definitions underneath.
It seems like they're just hollowing out the old terms.
Yeah.
Which brings up a critical question regarding the methodology of the modern magisterium. How does a modern text justify these shifts?
It's a great question.
How can a document claim to be in the tradition of Leo III, while simultaneously adopting the language of pluralism and property subordination that Leo III explicitly fought against? What is the mechanism that allows this?
That question leads us directly into the most profound philosophical critique in the entire review. The mechanism that allows for these shifts is the modern redefinition of what truth itself actually is.
If we've established that the encyclical treats human dignity as an infinite, untouchable given and treats classical rights as highly mutable, it stands to reason that its underlying epistemology, its theory of truth, must also be fluid.
And that brings us to the specter of modernism.
Let's get into it. We are examining paragraphs 25 to 27 and paragraph 45 of Magnifica Humanitas.
The encyclical describes truth as a process of shared discernment.
It states that truth grows over time through human experience.
We're right. It leans heavily on a famous Francis-era analogy, describing truth not as a sphere where every point is equidistant from the center, but as a multifaceted polyhedron that reflects different aspects of reality.
And perhaps most provocatively of all, it claims the Church does not claim a monopoly on truth.
For a pre-1958 theologian trained in the anti-modernist oaths, that language doesn't just raise red flags, it sets off deafening existential alarm bells.
I can imagine. The idea of growing truth edges dangerously close to the primary theological crisis of the early 20th century.
Modernism.
The reviewer goes straight to Pope Pius X's 1907 decree Lamentabili Sign, which formally condemned the errors of the modernists. Specifically, the reviewer targets Error 58.
Let's read the exact condemnation of Error 58 to understand the stakes here. Pius X condemned the proposition that, quote, truth is no more immutable than man himself, inasmuch as it evolves with him, in him, and through him.
The modernist crisis, driven by figures like Alfred Loisy and George Tyrrell, posited the idea of vital immanence.
Right.
They argued that revelation wasn't a set of objective facts handed down by God from the outside, but rather an internal, subjective religious experience that bubbles up from within humanity and evolves as human culture evolves. Therefore, dogma must constantly change to match the spirit of the age.
Exactly.
If truth evolves, dogma evolves. If dogma evolves, the religion of 2026 can fundamentally contradict the religion of 1826, and you could still call it Catholic.
To prevent this, the strict manualist tradition enforced a rigorous requirement for the development of doctrine. It is captured in the famous formula from the First Vatican Council, echoing Vincent of Lorenz, eodem sensu eodemque sententia.
The same sense and the same meaning. Let's dive deep into the mechanics of objective deposit versus subjective grasp, because this is the firewall against modernism.
Yes, let's do that.
The deposit of faith, the objective reality of what God revealed to the apostles, is entirely fixed. It closed with the death of the last apostle. Objective truth does not grow. It is immutable.
However, our subjective understanding of that fixed reality, our ability to articulate it, can deepen over centuries. The Church's theological vocabulary can become more precise.
If I can try another analogy here just to lock this in, think of the deposit of faith like a fully grown ancient oak tree. Development of doctrine is the tree growing new branches, or perhaps us discovering root systems we hadn't mapped before. The trunk remains exactly the same. The genetic code of the tree is the same. It is simply articulating itself further into the sky.
I love that analogy.
But the reviewer is arguing that the encyclical's language of a process of shared discernment allows for a totally different kind of evolution. It allows the tree to decide that, based on the modern climate, it is going to evolve into a bird.
Yes.
And the modern theologian will still call that growth.
That is a brilliant illustration of the reviewer's fear. The encyclical fails to make the rigorous distinction between the objective deposit of truth and the subjective grasp of it.
By blending them into a multifaceted polyhedron that grows, the document allows real, substantive ruptures.
Like the tree becoming a bird, or the death penalty shifting from an instrument of justice to an inherent evil, or religious pluralism morphing from a tolerated evil to a natural right.
All smuggled into the Church under the guise of maturing implications.
Exactly. And what about that highly contentious phrase, the Church does not claim a monopoly on truth?
Yeah, when a secular reader sees that, they think, well, obviously, the Catholic Church doesn't claim to have a monopoly on quantum physics or the cure for cancer or the mathematics of orbital mechanics.
And if read with maximum charity, that is exactly what the drafters of the encyclical likely meant. Pope Pius XII said as much in his 1950 encyclical Humani Generis. The Church respects the autonomy of the human sciences and natural reason.
But the reviewer points out that Magnifica Humanitas is a document about the moral ordering of society, the nature of the human person, and the ethics of technology.
Right. To drop the phrase, no monopoly on truth, into that context without aggressive ironclad qualifications slides the text right into the abyss of indifferentism.
Indifferentism being the idea that one religion is as good as another, the idea that the Catholic Church is just one of many equal participants in a global, multi-faith search for meaning rather than the singular arc of salvation.
Leo III condemned this explicitly in Immortal Day.
The core, unbending dogma of the Catholic faith is that she possesses the unique, infallible fullness of revealed truth regarding salvation and morality. To say she doesn't have a monopoly on truth in the moral sphere hollows out the very rationale for her authority.
The reviewer is pulling no punches here. If you compromise the immutability of truth, you compromise everything.
I deduce the censures here are among the most severe in the review.
They are the most severe. For the growing truth and shared discernment language, the reviewer assigns Favon's modernismo favoring modernism.
Wow.
And for the monopoly claim, the censure is Favon's indifferentismo favoring indifferentism.
It is genuinely fascinating how mathematically interconnected classical theology is.
Oh, it's a tight system.
If truth isn't a fixed, objective, external reality that a human being must intellectually submit to, but is instead a relational, evolving process of shared dialogue, then it logically follows that the Church's view of humanity's ultimate purpose will also become purely relational.
Exactly. If truth is a dialogue, then human nature must just be a dialogue.
And this brings us directly into the reviewer's critique of the encyclical's relational anthropology and how that anthropology severely softens the theology of the afterlife. Let's look at paragraphs 48 and 50.
Right. Magnifica Humanitas locates the imago Dei, the image of God, primarily in relationship, and the Trinitarian dynamic of love received and shared.
It argues that we are most fully human, most fully reflecting God when we are in communion with others.
Now, honestly, to me and probably to many of you listening, this sounds incredibly orthodox and deeply beautiful.
It does. God is Trinity. God is an eternal communion of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Therefore, we are made in his image specifically when we reflect that communion by loving others. Why does the strict Thomist find this problematic?
Because a strict Thomist insists that the image of God resides first and foremost in the rational faculties of the intellect and the will.
Your ability to know the truth with your intellect and choose the good with your will.
That is the classical definition of a person. Boethius famously defined a person as individua substantia rationalis naturae, an individual substance of a rational nature. It is a substance-based ontology, not a relational ontology.
Let me push back here, because this really does feel like academic hair splitting. Intellect versus relationality. Substance versus communion. Why is the reviewer so concerned about prioritizing the intellect over relationships? Doesn't the modern world need more relationality?
The modern world might need it practically, but metaphysically, prioritizing relationships over substance is dangerous when you look at the downstream effects on human rights.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics.
Think about a person in permanent solitary confinement, or a person in a deep, unresponsive coma, or an embryo.
Right.
If the defining characteristic of the image of God is relationality and the dynamic of love shared, what happens to the dignity of a person when their capacity for relationships is permanently severed, suspended, or not yet developed?
Oh, I see the trap. If the image of God requires active communion, the comatose patient is suddenly less of an image of God than a healthy person with a robust social life.
Exactly. A Thomist avoids this trap entirely, the Thomist says. The comatose patient's mens, their rational soul with its faculties of intellect and will, remains ontologically intact as an individual substance, even if it cannot currently operate through the damaged physical brain.
Therefore, the imago Dei is 100% fully present. Relationality and communion are secondary expressions of that primary, unchangeable, rational nature.
Spot on.
To use a technological analogy for our AI-focused topic, the Thomist is saying the image of God is the CPU, the processor, the intellect itself.
Yes.
Even if the computer is utterly disconnected from the Wi-Fi network, the relationships, it's still fully a computer. But the encyclical's relational anthropology implies that the Wi-Fi connection is the computer. If you lose the network, you lose the essence.
That is exactly the philosophical vulnerability the reviewer is pointing out. By over-socializing the imago Dei, you weaken its metaphysical anchor. And this shift doesn't just affect how we view comatose patients. It profoundly changes how we define sin.
Because if the essence of humanity is the intellect and will, then sin is a disorder of those faculties. The intellect is darkened, the will stubbornly chooses a lesser temporal good over the supreme good of God. It is an objective rebellion.
Right. But if the essence of humanity is primarily relationship, then sin is reduced to merely a failure of communion. It becomes a failure to be empathetic, a failure to be inclusive, a rupture of human solidarity.
Sin becomes horizontal rather than vertical.
And the reviewer points out that this horizontal relational view of sin logically leads to a massive softening of eschatology.
Eschatology being the theology of the last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. How does the encyclical handle the ultimate fate of humanity?
The reviewer directs our attention to paragraphs 210, 211, and 233. The encyclical speaks extensively of recapitulation, leaning on Ephesians 1.10, where all things are united in Christ.
The document states that nothing will be lost that is authentically human, and that in the end, everything will be purified, healed, and reunited in the cosmic embrace of the Creator.
Which sounds incredibly hopeful and comforting.
It does. But the pre-1958 manualist reads this text and is stunned by a glaring, deafening omission. We're looking at a 244-paragraph document dealing with the ultimate choices facing the human race, the existential threat of a technocratic dystopia, the future of human souls in a digitized world.
And the encyclical never once mentions hell.
Wow.
It never mentions the final judgment of the wicked. It never mentions the real, dogmatic possibility of eternal damnation.
It focuses entirely on the hope of cosmic reunification. It paints a picture where God's infinite dignity just automatically subsumes everyone in the end.
Yes. The theological tone leans heavily toward what is known as Balthasarian universalism.
Named after the 20th century theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who popularized the idea that Christians can reasonably hope that all human beings may ultimately be saved.
Right. Now, the encyclical doesn't explicitly deny the existence of hell, right? It doesn't formulate a heresy that hell is empty.
It does not explicitly deny it, it simply ignores it entirely.
But to a classical theologian formed on the intense realism of the four last things, silence on the reality of eternal separation from God is not neutrality. Silence is a loud theological datum.
If you are warning humanity about the grave evils of the technocratic paradigm, but you fail to mention the eternal consequences of participating in those grave evils, your moral theology has lost its ultimate teeth.
Exactly. Given that it's an omission rather than an explicit denial, I assume the reviewer doesn't slap a heresy charge here. What is the censure for this eschatological silence?
Oh, wait, I've got it here. The reviewer grades the eschatology of the encyclical as suspect.
A suspect, yeah.
It is highly suspicious by omission, failing to present the full, balanced truth of divine justice alongside divine mercy.
Okay, so we have spent a massive amount of time in the deep theological weeds here.
Oh, absolutely. We've dissected the metaphysics of infinite dignity, the collapse of retributive justice, the condemnation of religious pluralism, the immutability of truth against modernism, and the relational softening of hell.
But let's pull the narrative back to the macro level. Magnifica Humanitas was not written just to do systematic theology. It was written to combat the very real, immediate threat of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and transhumanism.
Right.
After completely dismantling the document's metaphysical operating system, does the strict Thomist find anything of value in the Pope's practical warnings?
This is perhaps the most surprising and fascinating twist in the entire review. Despite the unsparing, heavy doctrinal critiques we just mapped out, the pre-1958 reviewer explicitly acknowledges that there is substantial, profoundly sound material in the encyclical's practical applications.
Really, after calling its foundations ambiguous, rash, and favoring modernism, the reviewer suddenly agrees with the Pope.
Yes. Because when the encyclical finally turns its gaze away from abstract definitions of pluralism and looks directly at the raw, practical realities of Silicon Valley, algorithmic manipulation, and the transhumanist movement, the pre-Vatican II Thomist and the 2026 Pope suddenly find themselves fighting in the exact same trench.
Let's trace the mechanics of how they arrive at that common ground. The Pope organizes his attack on AI using two deeply resonant biblical images: the Tower of Babel versus Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem.
It is a masterful use of scriptural typology. The encyclical uses the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11 to represent technological homogenization.
Babel was the ultimate human attempt to reach heaven, to secure absolute dominance and stability using a single language and a single unifying technology, the brick.
And crucially, they did it completely without reference to God. It is the ultimate symbol of human pride, which inevitably results in linguistic dispersion, alienation, and confusion.
And the Pope contrasts that technological pride with the figure of Nehemiah. Nehemiah returns from the Babylonian exile to a ruined Jerusalem. He doesn't attempt to build a soaring, hubristic monument to human power.
He humbly organizes the local families to rebuild the defensive walls of the city, piece by piece, stone by stone. He respects human limits, relies entirely on God's providence, and shares the responsibility locally.
The encyclical deploys this Babel imagery to launch a blistering attack on what it calls the technocratic paradigm. This is detailed in paragraphs 92 to 95.
The technocratic paradigm is the pervasive modern mindset, where sheer efficiency, optimization, and profit dictate the value of all things.
Under this paradigm, creation is no longer a gift to be stewarded. It is merely raw material to be exploited.
And human beings are no longer subjects. They are reduced to cogs in a digital machine, optimized for maximum economic output or algorithmic engagement.
And the ultimate logical endpoint of this technocratic paradigm is the transhumanist and post-humanist movement, which the encyclical tackles head-on in paragraphs 115 through 117.
This section is where the manualist reviewer actively cheers on the encyclical. Magnifica Humanitas fiercely, unequivocally rejects transhumanism.
It identifies the profound existential danger of treating human limitations, things like physical illness, biological aging, intellectual vulnerability, and eventually death, merely as technical defects to be corrected by technological intervention.
Because in the classical Christian view, those limitations aren't bugs in the software. They are the very realities through which humanity actually matures in virtue. Suffering, aging, and limits are the context in which we learn faith, hope, and charity.
Exactly. The encyclical brilliantly defends the inherent given biological nature of the human being against Promethean attempts to re-engineer it.
The Pope warns that elevating our technical power to alter human biology without a corresponding increase in our moral wisdom leads directly to anthropological regression.
If we begin to view the human body as just hardware to be upgraded, or the human mind as software to be uploaded to a server, we completely destroy the hylomorphic unity of body and soul. We lose the essence of our humanity.
This presents a wild, deeply ironic synthesis. Let's look at the juxtaposition here. The manualist reviewer believes that the Pope's metaphysical language on dignity, truth, and sin is dangerously loose.
The reviewer thinks the Pope has basically untethered the classical definitions that protect the Church.
Yet, when facing the abyss of the AI age, the reviewer completely 100% agrees with the Pope's ultimate practical conclusion. We must fiercely protect the finite, bounded, created nature of humanity from the infinite, boundaryless ambitions of the tech oligarchs.
It is the great paradox of this text. The Thomist essentially says to the Pope, your modern philosophical definitions of human dignity are sloppy and blur the vital lines between the creator and the creature. But your ethical defense of the human body against AI algorithms is exactly prophetically right.
Both the strict manualist and the modern Pope agree on the core reality. Humanity is a created, bounded gift with natural limits. It is not raw material to be hacked, optimized, and endlessly reprogrammed by artificial intelligence.
So what does this monumental intellectual collision mean for you, the listener? Whether you are writing a thesis on social doctrine or simply trying to navigate your own life in an increasingly digitized algorithmic world? Let's trace the full arc of the journey we've just taken.
We took a highly anticipated 2026 encyclical dealing with the most cutting-edge, futuristic issues of our time: AI, transhumanism, digital spaces. And we forced it through the rigid, unforgiving, hyper-precise X-ray machine of pre-1958 Thomistic theology.
And that X-ray exposed profound structural shifts in the bedrock of Catholic theology. We saw how adopting the pastoral phrase infinite dignity risks a massive metaphysical category error, blurring God and creature.
We explored the mechanics of how detaching dignity from moral choices destroys the historical retributive justification for the state's right of the sword.
We mapped the tension between modern religious pluralism and the 19th-century condemnations of it. We identified the specter of vital immanence in modernism and the idea of a growing truth, and we noted the chilling eschatological silence regarding the final judgment.
But amidst all those theological friction points, we also found deep, vital common ground in the trench warfare against the technocratic paradigm. Which begs the ultimate question for an advanced student of theology. What is the true value of this exercise? Why subject a modern pastoral document to this kind of brutal classical dissection?
The absolute value of this exercise lies in forcing us to rigorously, unapologetically define our terms.
Yes.
Whether your personal theological sympathies lie with the encyclical's modern pastoral developments, or whether you find yourself nodding along with the reviewer's classical strictness, the reality is this: you cannot defend what you cannot accurately define.
If the Church is going to mount a successful, enduring defense of humanity against the homogenizing, reducing power of artificial intelligence, she must be absolutely metaphysically precise about what a human being actually is.
Vague, emotive, soaring language might sound inspiring when preached from a pulpit, but vague language will not survive the brutal, unfeeling, optimizing logic of an AI algorithm. Algorithms exploit ambiguity. Only rigid truth can act as a firewall.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as we conclude. The encyclical rightly warns that AI algorithms optimize for efficiency. They flatten out the complex, messy, vulnerable, and deeply mysterious reality of human nature into predictable, manageable data points.
Right.
But if the Church herself continues to soften her own rigid classical definitions of truth, sin, justice, and judgment in order to be more relational, more pastoral, and more palatable to modern sensibilities, does she risk adopting her own kind of theological algorithm?
Oh, wow.
Is the modern magisterium optimizing for maximal inclusion and minimal friction at the direct expense of objective metaphysical reality? Are we trying to fight the merciless technocratic paradigm with a theology that has already compromised its own operating system?
It is a chilling, essential question for the future of the Church. If our diagnostic tools are murky, if we can no longer define the boundaries of the soul, how can we possibly hope to cure the patient?
Precisely. When you are looking at the X-ray of the modern world, you need to know exactly where the bone ends and the break begins. Thank you for joining us on this massive deep dive into the theological muddy waters of the future. Keep reading the sources closely, keep pushing back on the easy definitions, and above all, keep seeking the immutable truth in the texts.